Welcome to IJ4EU Confidential, where we go behind the scenes of groundbreaking investigative journalism. I'm Timothy Large from the International Press Institute in Vienna, and today we have a fascinating special episode of the podcast. Just a few minutes ago, IPI colleagues and I wrapped up a public discussion about the Gaza Project. Now, the Gaza Project is an extraordinary example of cross-border collaborative journalism. It was led by Forbidden Stories. If you don't know, Forbidden Stories is a global network of journalists whose mission it is to continue the investigations of other reporters who have been silenced. In the case of the Gaza Project, those silenced are at least 110 Palestinian journalists who have been killed, allegedly targeted by Israel, since the start of the Israel-Gaza War on October the 7th last year. Now, I should stress that unlike many of the investigations featured on this podcast, the Gaza Project is not a project supported by our IJ4EU Fund for Cross-Border Journalism, though Forbidden Stories was a former IJ4EU grantee. Even so, the what, the why, and the how of this investigation will be of great interest, I think, to listeners of this podcast. Together with my IPI colleagues Scott Griffin and Amy Brulette, I was delighted to speak with the leading contributors to the Gaza Project. It was a fascinating conversation. I recommend you listen to it. So here it is.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon or good morning, good evening to all of you who are tuning into this webinar with us. We want to welcome you from my side, from the International Press Institute. My name is Scott Griffin. I'm the Interim Executive Director of IPI, which is a global network of editors, journalists, and publishers working to defend press freedom and independent media wherever they are threatened. And we're here today to talk about the findings of a really groundbreaking investigation carried out or led by Forbidden Stories and involving a cross-border organization of journalists from a number of different countries, looking into the targeting of journalists in Gaza and what they have called the unprecedented Israeli targeting of Palestinian journalists since the beginning of the war last October. By our last count, at least 110 Palestinian journalists have been killed since last October. This is the largest number of journalists to be killed in this span of time in any modern war or conflict. I think most of us on this call are familiar with the horrors that have been taking place in Gaza for the media based there. And this investigation, as I think many of us are aware, really pulled back the curtain on what's been happening, and in particular, looking at and really calling into question the Israeli denials about the possible direct targeting of journalists in Gaza. Through this Gaza Project. And we're really honored to be joined this afternoon by several journalists and editors who led this groundbreaking project. Laurent Richard from Forbidden Stories, Hoda Osman from Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, Manisha Ganguly from The Guardian, and Walid Batrawi, who is an IPI executive board member and a Palestinian media trainer and consultant. So I want to welcome all of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and talk about the findings of the Gaza Project, but also a little bit about how this team came together and the methodology that you used to come out with these very important findings. Just a few notes about how we're going to carry out this conversation. We really wanted this to be a dynamic discussion, a conversation. So this is actually going to be a co-moderated effort from my side to kick it off, but I'm happy to be joined by two of my colleagues today. Amy Brulette, our Director of Advocacy, who's already here on the screen, and Tim Large, who's IPI's Director of Independent Media Programs. So we're going to be doing a little bit of switching off to bring in different perspectives, and I'll be passing it on to them after this first round here. I do want to remind everybody who's joining in that we are recording this call or this webinar, and we plan to put up the video later, also for those who weren't able to join us today live. And we will also have a chance to have questions toward the end of the webinar. So, if you have questions as we're going through the discussion, please keep those in mind. you'll be able to share those in the chat or directly in the question and answer part here. So with that in mind, I kind of want to now turn to our participants here, and I want to start off just kind of with a general question for all of you, and I'm going to ask you also to introduce yourselves briefly, but I really want to ask you first about the why of this project, because we're going to get to the findings, we're going to get to the methodology, we're going to talk about what comes next, but I want to start out with why. What drove this project? Why did you feel that this investigation, this cross-border reporting initiative was so important right now? And I want to pass it over, first of all, to Laurent from Forbidden Stories. And if you could all just briefly introduce yourselves and then kind of explain your role in the project, and then from your perspective, why this was so needed.
Hi, thank you, Scott. Hello, hi everyone. Thank you for having us and organizing this important talk about the Gaza Project. So I'm Laurent Richard. I'm the founder and the executive director of Forbidden Stories. So Forbidden Stories is a non-profit based in Paris, and our mission is to continue the work of assassinated or under threat or jail reporters, and we do that for almost 7 years. And about your question about why we did the Gaza Project, I think the answer is quite simple. We have never seen a level and a number of journalists being killed in a war since we never seen that. And since October 7, we have more than 100 journalists who have been killed over there. So we discussed with many people who are taking part of this panel, with Oda from Marriage, with Anisha from The Guardian, with the team of Paper Trail Media, and with all the journalists around the globe to see what we were able to do, what we can do facing that, knowing that we don't have, it was not possible to have access to the area. And knowing that it was necessary to investigate the targeting of journalists in Gaza and in the West Bank, to trying to understand what is happening, and trying to see how the Israeli army, the Israeli military were targeting the journalists over there. And what the situation was of course quite more than problematic from France, but I think from many other countries. The news on Gaza is always the same. You have just the news about the strikes, the news about the numbers of people being killed, and including the news about the number of the police being killed, and that's it. And so the Gaza Project goal and mission was to gather many journalists around the world, 50 journalists from 13 news organizations, to investigate the targeting of journalists over there. Why investigating the targeting journalists is crucial? Because if you don't have any journalist in a conflict like this one, or in any kind of conflict, in any kind of war, you don't have the possibility to inform the public opinion about what is happening over there, about what kind of war crimes are committed over there. So being a journalist over there and doing your work is crucial for democracy, I should say. There is no way to end impunity if there is no access to information. And if you don't have any journalists alive to do that, there is no way to inform the public opinion. The thing is that the only journalists who are doing that on a daily basis are amongst the victims as well. And they are displaced, they are targeted, they try to do their they are losing their families. They are living in the worst condition. And so that was necessary, again, to set up that network of journalists. And that was complex as well. That was full of challenges, because how to investigate an area when you are far from the place. So this is why it was crucial to work with the people like Walid here, who know the place more than other people. Who knows his street and was able to guide us in the methodology. It was crucial to work with Oda Osman and the network of Arij, who was a network of journalists in Palestine as well, who took part in the project. We did team up as well with Israeli journalists. It was crucial as well for us to have honest on a war, on a country that is dividing so much the people, dividing so much the community all around the globe, it was crucial for us to come from different perspectives, come from different countries, and to work together on that. That means using as well the OSINT and visual investigation that, and I'm sure that Manisha, who is leading the visual investigative team at the Garden, will explain more about what she did. And our work at Forbidden Stories with the talent of Léa Perrichon was coordinating that work on a daily basis. We were there to support all the group and to coordinate that.
Thanks, Lauren. Maybe if you could just also try to speak a little bit louder, what
Sure.
the participants, I think it was maybe a bit hard to hear, but I think we got the message. Thank you very much for that, for those initial thoughts. Hoda, can we go over to you? What was your why on this project? What drove your and RH's participation in this?
Thank you for having us today speak about this. I work with Arab Reporters for investigative journalism. I'm an investigative journalist based in New York, and I work as executive editor with Arish. And we've been working with Arab journalists on investigations for many, many years. Early on, I remember it was in November that the number had surpassed 30 journalists killed. And me and my colleagues, there were two colleagues who from Arish who were working with me on this project, Farah Jalad and Firas Tawil. We decided then that we have to start doing something because we weren't seeing, there were some attempts to do individual investigations into this, but we're speaking to the journalists there every day. And they are telling us we are being targeted. That's what they felt. That's what they thought. That's what they were sure of. Some of them had stopped wearing their press vests because they thought that if they wore the vest, they would be targeted because of it. People were trying to distance themselves from them because they felt being close to a journalist was going to be too risky for them. So we decided that we have to start doing something about it. And what we started with, and maybe our first contribution to the project when we ended up, when we started all working together in February, was a database. So there were various organizations collecting the information and creating lists of incidents where journalists were being targeted, where journalists had been killed. And we collated all these databases into one comprehensive database and then started further researching and investigating each case, adding things like social media accounts, possible sources that we could interview, pictures. Did the Israeli military respond and what did they say? And we created this big database and started looking at we created like a short list of incidents where we thought we should investigate more, about 20. So when we joined the project, when we all started working together, we came in with this knowledge of knowing a little bit the big picture of how many journalists were killed in airstrikes, how many were killed at home, how many were killed while working. So this was one of the first things that we in addition to that, because of Arish's role, we've been working with hundreds, thousands of Arab journalists over the years. We had connections with the journalists in Gaza, and I think that this was crucial. I personally have been speaking to journalists in Gaza every day since October. So we had trust, we had connections. We also had, together with Walid, we had the sort of the sensitivity and the ability to know how to speak to them, how to be patient, how to know what's going on that day at this particular hour in the area that they're in. So we don't reach out at the time that would be insensitive for us to ask questions. And remember, we're asking them questions. They're as Laurent said, this is a very unprecedented situation. Not just are they covering the war and they're part of it themselves, they're part of the story and they're covering the story, but they're also trapped. So they can't get out. And they have daily struggles of finding water for their family, finding food, standing in line for hours to go to the bathroom. And then we're calling them and asking them to talk to us about traumatic events that happened months or weeks before. So it required a certain sense of sensitivity on our part that I feel like us and Walid, we had and we knew how to do that. And in addition to that, we just worked together. It was really incredible how Forbidden Stories brought us all together where everyone was helping each other. So Manisha needs something and it's in Arabic and we go find it for her. I need an OSINT thing. I come to Manisha and she helps me with my OSINT request. it was really quite incredible as a collaboration. And I thank Forbidden Stories for their efforts and for making this happen.
Thanks a lot, Hoda. Waleed, can I come to you now?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Scott. Thanks to everyone. Yeah, I mean, in addition to me being a board member of IPI, I myself is an investigative journalist and have worked on different investigations. Nothing like this one, but I mean, in the Gaza Strip and in the occupied territories and across the Arab world and so on. But this was like the first kind of international Palestinian-related investigation, and I think what made me get involved is, first of all, I want to tell the story. I want to tell the story of my colleagues. Most of those people who have been killed, I know. Many of them I have trained. Many of them, if I don't know them personally, but I've heard about them through their stories, through the work that they did. In addition to that, it was very important to show the trend and show that this was actually happening. Targeting of journalists in Gaza and the killing of journalists in Gaza kind of is a continuation of what was going on all over the West Bank and including Jerusalem. So it's not a new policy, but it has been escalated. And I thought, if we do not expose these crimes against journalists, then, the next person would be my friend, my colleague, myself. So it was very important, to do this investigation and to be part of this investigation. And I think, it was also very important to have someone. I'm not trying to praise the work that I did, but it was very important to have someone who's editorially aware of what was going on, who knows the place, who knows the people, who has contacts in the Gaza Strip. It was, sometimes sometimes it would take me 2 minutes to get information because I know people. But on other times, it was very difficult to get information because of the situation that Huda described, communication blackout, people are being busy, us not being able to talk to people. I mean, emotionally, it was very heavy for me to talk to people. I mean, I was avoiding, before I got involved in this investigation, I was avoiding to talk to the families of my friends who have been killed. It's just because I had nothing to say, especially that I trained them. I was a safety and hostile environment trainer in Gaza. So everything that I told them, everything that I kind of asked them to do, they could not really implement because they were targeted, because there was no safe place, So I was kind of very hesitant to call them, to call their families and say, I'm very sorry for your loss. But suddenly to start calling them, when you need information. And that was really hard for me. But despite all that, they were very cooperative because they knew how important that was. And I think that Huda spoke about the trust. Some of them know me personally. Some of them know about me, know of me. And this is why they were open to talk, to give stories. In one case, the wife of someone who was injured, who is unconscious until today, she started sharing me, her emotions about how she was unable to deal with her husband, who's, so they wanted to speak to someone, not necessarily because of the investigation, but someone who's from the outsider community, someone whom they trust. And this was kind of a therapy for them as well. I mean, it's not only in the sake of the investigation, but it was a therapy for them. So this is why I got involved, and I think my role was basically to provide the local knowledge, to fact check what's the information that we have, to cross check the information as well, and most of the places that were mentioned in these investigations and all the investigations I have been to. For example, the school that Samer Abu Dakka was killed in, Khan Yunis, is just sharing a wall with the house of my in-laws. So this is why I got involved, and this is how I got involved.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Walid, we're going to jump into the kind of the what and the findings of the project in just a minute. But Manisha, before we do that, if you could also just, briefly summarize your role in the project and what motivated your participation.
Thanks very much, Scott. And thank you, IPI, for putting this excellent panel together. So I'm Manisha Ganguly. I'm the visual forensics lead for The Guardian, where I work as an investigations correspondent. And I mostly cover conflict with a specialism in investigating war crimes. I've been covering the conflict since October 7th, but mostly documenting the attacks on medical and civilian infrastructure. And I usually don't do pure open source reporting because I always work with people on the ground. But this is a very unique war from all of the others that I've covered, simply because Egypt and Israel have blocked foreign media from accessing, which means that I was sort of heavily reliant on Palestinian journalists on the ground to get information out. But at the same time, while I was documenting attacks on civilians, I was acutely conscious of the fact that there was this growing index of Palestinian journalists on the ground that were increasing, and the dwindling number of eyes on the ground from which I would be getting this information. And at the same time, the reason I sort of started looking into it and reached out to CPJ, who initially had the list, was because this is a conflict where we have a record number of journalists who are being killed alongside their families in airstrikes that are targeted on their homes. That is unique to any other war that I've covered so far, which sort of does raise questions about intentionality. And when you combine that with the telecoms blackout and the lack of foreign access, it begs the question, what are we not seeing? Which is kind of the conversation that Laurent and I had in Jordan when we met for the IJ4EU conference. And that is why we decided to get together, because I think combined with Hoda's incredible network, Walid's local knowledge, and my visual investigation skills, and the power of Forbidden Stories to bring it together, I felt like the only way to crack the story really is if all of us came together, because we all had different skill sets in different halves of the puzzle. And it was such an insurmountable crisis that it just made sense for us to do it together.
Thanks a lot, Manisha. I think what you just said at the end is what was, really, I think, already clear from what we've heard from all of you, which is this really powerful, I think, mix of expertise and specialization and different roles that each of you played in this project. I think which was clearly a big factor for the success of what you all were able to do. And I think what we want to do now is kind of jump a little bit into the findings of the project. And to help us do that, I want to pass it over to my colleague, Amy Brulette, who's IPI's Director of Advocacy. Amy, can you take us forward from here?
Sure. Thanks, Scott. And thanks to all of our guests who've taken the time today to speak about this really important and critical project. So in the next, 15 minutes or so, I'd like to dig in a little bit more on the findings about what the various investigations showed and what they focused on, and maybe some of the really important stories that came out of these investigations as well. So my first question is for Laurent. Perhaps you can just kind of summarize some of the main findings and the scope of these investigations.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. So to give you some few of the findings that we published for the Gaza Project, basically we find out first that 40 of the journalists who have been killed were killed at home. We find as well that 40 journalists who were killed were working for an organization believed to be affiliated to the Hamas organization. We find as well that 18 of the journalists have been injured, killed, or allegedly targeted by drones. So the drone aspect of the use of the drone during that conflict is a very a key thing, a key aspect of our investigation, because a drone is supposed to be a precision weapons to avoid collateral damage, to avoid killing civilians. And when you are operating a drone, you know what you're going to do, and you know who you're going to kill. Or at least when the person is wearing a press vest, you know that the person is supposedly to be a journalist. And 14 people who were wearing a press vest, 14 journalists have been wearing a press vest, were killed or allegedly targeted or injured while they were wearing a press vest. We find as well, and we did investigate a lot, the targeting of the building as well. It's not only an attack against journalists, it's an attack against the press ecosystem of there. We talk, I think Walid discussed about the communication blackout. This is part of the war as well, that Israel is running there. But destroying the media offices, the media headquarters, is part of their war as well against access to information. And we find out that six offices have been fully or partially destroyed since October 7th. 6 offices were hosting the journalists working in Gaza.
Thank you. So I think this really kind of shows both the breadth and the scope of this whole project, and how some of the findings are actually kind of cultivated through a range of different stories and approaches. For me, I think that's one of the more interesting parts of this project, is that how the overall evidence base is built through a range of different stories and a range of different techniques. So I'd like to turn now to Hoda and Manisha, who collaborated on a few of these really important stories. One is about the press house, and the other is called The Gray Zone, which examined the IDF's intentional targeting of journalists. So first, maybe we can just turn to Hoda and maybe walk us through a little bit of the story about the press house, and perhaps explain a bit of what the press house was and how important it was for journalism in Gaza.
Press House was a special place. It was a nonprofit created in 2013 by Bilal Jadallah. It was a politically independent space for journalists. It aimed to develop journalist capacities. It had workshops for journalists. It supported them in each and every way. And Bilal Jadallah was the heart of Press House, and his impact on journalism and on journalists in Gaza may be, sadly, most captured by the headline of that story: an incredible loss for Palestine. This was a quote from the representative of the Norwegian government office in the West Bank. Norway was one of the main funders of Press House. It was really a loss for the journalists and for everyone in Gaza. I remember the day that he was killed on November 19th. I spoke to several journalists that day, and I can feel the shock and the devastation. Even over the phone, it was tangible how shocking and how sad this was. The story that we did with The Guardian about Press House walked through what Press House meant and what Bilal Jadallah meant for journalism and for journalists, but also through some of what happened. And maybe I can very quickly tell the story of what happened to Press House. After Israel issued evacuation orders, many of the journalists had left the south. Bilal Jadallah and a few others from Press House decided to stay in Gaza City. Over the course of 2 weeks, 3 people from Press House were killed between November 6th and November 19th, which is when Bilal Jadallah, in a car, in a route that was a street that was marked by the Israeli military as a safe route in yellow, in his car, was killed while on this street. Afterwards, we were able to speak with an eyewitness, someone who was a close friend of Bilal Jadallah, and who formerly worked as financial director at Press House, who stayed in Press House with his family because his house was besieged and he had to find a place to go. And while he was inside the building, Israeli tanks came and fired directly at Press House. Thankfully, he managed to leave the next day, but afterwards, the building was completely destroyed, even though it's common practice, especially by the foreign organizations or governments, to send the coordinates, the locations of these buildings to the Israeli military, so they know not to target them because they are media and journalism offices. In spite of that, the building was completely demolished.
Thank you. And this kind of leads, I guess, into the next story that you both worked on collaboratively. Manisha, maybe you could also talk about a little bit more about the story called The Gray Zone. Yeah, thank you.
So when we were looking at the very long list of casualties of Palestinian journalists, we noticed that 30% of them worked for media outlets that were affiliated or closely tied to Hamas. And this is something that we see a lot in the misinformation, disinformation floating around in social media. Every time a Palestinian journalist dies, there is an accusation that they worked for Hamas, which almost seems like a justification for it. However, under international humanitarian law, journalists are recognized as civilians and are given protection. However, during the course of the project, as we started digging into what happened to Al-Aqsa journalists, a majority of whom were killed in airstrikes on their homes and died alongside their families in the middle of the night, we actually managed to get a conversation with the IDF, where essentially a senior IDF spokesperson told reporters in the consortium that there was, quote, no difference between working for the media outlet and belonging to Hamas's armed wing. It's a sweeping statement that legal experts described as alarming. In fact, one legal expert told us that it shows a complete misunderstanding or just a complete willful disregard for international law. Now, 6 hours after we published the story, the IDF issued a press release where it said that some outlets have published a statement where it shows that the IDF essentially sees some journalists as legitimate targets in the military operation, and that it mischaracterizes IDF policy. But despite the denial, the statements to us were entirely on the record. So it sort of begs the question whether these journalists were intentionally killed. And then just quickly on Press House, I think the other thing that was sort of really interesting in this war and quite horrific is that when, from the start of the war, the IDF has been asking people to move south. And they've been doing that by marking out specific humanitarian routes that are considered safe for passage. Now, Bilal, who is the godfather of Palestinian journalism and the founder of Press House, refused to leave because he felt like he was abandoning the reporters who were still reporting from Gaza. But after the death of quite a few of them, I think he finally was convinced that he was being targeted and decided to leave. And what he did was pack a bag, get his ID, and follow the IDF's own orders to use a specific humanitarian route that was marked safe, that was broadcast multiple times on IDF social media in multiple languages. And then halfway through the route, his car gets hit and he dies. And so what Hoda and I managed to do is effectively get images of the car, analyze, and I sat together with weapons experts to effectively, conclusively say that it is possibly an Israeli tank shell that killed him. So yes, Bilal Jadallah's death is collateral damage, but he was asked to evacuate by the IDF along a safe route. He did as he was told. Why is he still dead? And this seems to be a recurrent theme for all of the Palestinian journalists, whether you look at the Haji building investigation that, again, Hoda worked quite a lot on. You have journalists who were told that an Israeli airstrike is going to hit a specific building. So they moved to a different building to document it. And then it is the second building that gets hit and kills them all. And just very quickly on press infrastructure, because that was the one that was purely visual, open source based. We managed to track down sort of the main buildings that house media offices and newsrooms across Gaza. And we were able to find that 6 of them were completely destroyed by what appeared to be Israeli airstrikes. And we know they're Israeli airstrikes because there is only one side in this war that has air power. And when you look at them on satellite imagery, they are massive 2,000 bomb craters that cannot be anything else. And so in the first week or so, about 10 media offices are destroyed. And that seems quite inconsequential when you have 100 human Palestinian journalists who've died. But the real fact is that there are 3 problems with this. One is it has a chilling effect for the future of Palestinian journalism in Gaza. Second, it means that journalists who may be still there trying to report have no safe space. A lot of these media offices, like the AFP offices, had coordinates that were sent over to the IDF. And the IDF said that they were aware, but later said, we cannot protect you. And finally, what does this mean for Palestinian journalists who want to return to Gaza and rebuild their lives and continue journalism? There is absolutely nothing left for them to return to, and the IDF has at no point communicated what is the plan of return for IDPs.
Thank you. There's a lot there I think we can unpack when we talk more about the methodology questions. But I want to get quickly to Walid. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about the findings about the broader impact of the war in the West Bank, and why looking at the wider issues in the West Bank is a critical part of this project as well.
Yeah, because because this trend of attacking and the harassment of journalists did not start as of October 7th. It has been there before. I can remember, I was just thinking what to say about this, but I remember that in 1992, I was first beaten in Hebron by Israeli soldiers. So that goes to 1992 when I started. I started in 1991, and the first thing, the next year, I get beaten by Israeli soldiers inside Hebron, and this continued over the years. So it's nothing. It may not look as massive as what is happening now in Gaza, but it has been a trend. Physical harassment, movement restriction, killing of journalists, and we have seen Shireen Abu Akleh and others. Before Shireen Abu Akleh, since 2000, there have been about 52 journalists killed in the West Bank, and no one was actually held to account for that. So this is a continuation, and the investigation about Al-Ghad TV that I worked on with Forbidden Stories, and it really showed that Al-Ghad TV was targeted, directly targeted by the Israeli army, and this was not the first one, not the first targeting of Al-Ghad TV, but this was the second targeting in a span of a year, actually. So what's happening in the West Bank is not only limited also to harassment by Israeli soldiers, but also by settlers. And I also recall that in 1994, it was the first time when I was harassed by settlers, and this has continued and escalated even more after October 7th, because everything now is allowed. They're allowed to carry weapons, they're allowed to go into the streets and so on. So I think that this policy of targeting journalists, again, I would say, did not start on October 7th or after October 7th, but it has been there for a long time. And what makes it worse is that no one is being held to account, and everyone is just escaping justice. And I think this is, again, why I took part in this investigation.
Thank you so much. I think we can, at this point, turn to Tim and get more into the questions on the methodology.
Sure. Thanks, Amy. And thanks to all of you for a really fascinating discussion. We've covered the why. We've talked about the what. So let's get to the how, the methodology. And I'd like to start by asking you about the collaborative nature of this project. And what really strikes me about this is just the sheer scale and the sheer complexity of this collaboration. And let's just remind people, this was a 4-month investigation, around 50 journalists involved, 13 organizations. That's a lot to pull together. So maybe this is a question to Laurent, first of all. How did you do all of that? How did you make sure everybody was effectively collaborating while also not letting the cat out of the bag before publication?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's each project we run at Forbidden Stories is very different. This one was extremely different from the Cartel Project, where we were continuing the work of a Mexican journalist killed in Mexico, or the Pegasus Project. This one was extremely difficult because, again, of the lack of access to the area, and the need to have resources like the resources of Manisha the Guardian to investigate through OSINT, all of that. Then you have the skills you can. So for each project, we try to set up a kind of dream team. The goal is to gather many journalists who can come from different perspectives with different skills, and then to define a methodology that was described at the beginning of the talk. But then you still need some rules, because the collaborative journalism model is not the big trend in our ecosystem. The still main principal trend is more the lone wolf reporter model. And what we are doing at Forbidden Stories is exactly the opposite. We do work together. That means that we ask every partner to share day by day his or her findings, and to share his draft as well, and to make sure that we have a deadline. We have some conference call every 2 or 3 days. We have some large conference call. We have some specific conference calls based on the leads. Then we try as well to amplify what we are doing through the republishing of our stories. And this is where Irish did help a lot as well, because all the stories were as well published in many Arabic countries, were published in Hebrew as well. And the goal of that is really to make sure that a large community of people would be aware about the findings. It was extremely challenging as well because of the need to have some evidence of what we were talking about. And one of the major revelation we did not address so far in the panel was we were able to prove that the AFP building was intentionally targeted by Israeli with tanks, with the use of tanks. And we were able to prove through satellite pictures that we were able to see some traces of the tanks the day before, the day after the shooting, despite the denial of the Israeli army. So we did not only show the pattern about how did they target and do they target the journalists, but as well, how do they communicate with public opinion, and how they are systematically denying or pretending that this journalist is linked to Hamas organization, for instance, or that AFP building was not targeted by Israeli military vehicle, for instance. So working and running such collaborative project is always challenging. Of course, we are the one thing that is very key is to have some rules. Collaborative journalism could be a very romantic idea, and it is, but not always. You need to have some rules. You need to have as well people respecting some rules. You need to have a deadline, and you need to make some compromise as well about the date of the publication, about the level of fact-checking that was extremely high. There is no way we can make a mistake in our stories as well. Because if one is doing a mistake in one of his drafts, then the entire group would be impacted. So the responsibility when you take part in such collaborative project is extremely high on the shoulder. And our role at Forbidden Stories is to provide all those investigative teams in Germany, in many countries, with coordination forces. And this is where we do help a lot with the work of Leah and other journalists who are not only investigating the leads, but coordinating all of that to make that possible at the end.
I want to come in a second to the issue of fact-checking and verification. But first, it seems to me that you analyzed around 100 cases of journalists and media workers who were killed, and plenty of other cases of journalists being targeted or threatened or injured and so on. And presumably you must have had to make decisions about which cases you would focus on. And this in a way touches on the vexed question of, who is a journalist? Like, is a member of the public with some cell phone footage a journalist? Is a Hamas propagandist a journalist? Did you care did you even ask that question when you were deciding which cases to focus on? Is that even the right question to ask? Just if you could talk us through a bit of your decision making.
Actually, what we were caring about was the way the Israeli army was targeted journalists. That was our main goal. When a drone operator is shooting at someone who's wearing a press vest, we wanted to investigate that. When the AFP tower, the AFP building is targeted, we wanted to investigate that. Then, of course, you have all those questions about, which is a very key question. Do the Israeli army consider journalists who are working for Hamas-affiliated organization as a legitimate target, military target? When you are running a war, when you are running a conflict, there are still some rules, international rules, about humanitarian international rules that you need to respect. Otherwise, you will go directly to the ICC. And one of the answers that we got, as Manisha was mentioning this episode, when a spokesperson was explaining, yes, we consider people who can work for Al-Aqsa TV as a legitimate target. It's a violation of the international human law. And this is, I'm sure, why the army, 6 hours after the publication of that, did step back from that statement and explain that spokesperson was really saying something that was not representing the policy. So that was our main goal, is to pay attention to how Israeli army, since they are as well blocking the access to the other ones, to investigate not only the attack against journalists, but the attack against access to information.
Yeah. I'd like to ask you now about the challenges of verifying eyewitness testimonies. This project drew upon testimonies from, I believe, 120 or so witnesses in both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. They included journalists, witnesses to military activities, and so on. And of course, many of you, almost all of you, were working remotely. So how did you verify, fact check what they told you? How could you be sure it was reliable, especially given the fact that you couldn't be on the ground in Gaza?
I'm happy to speak about this, and maybe Walid too, because between the two of us, actually, and my 2 colleagues, we did almost all of the interviews in Gaza and the West Bank. I think that, surprisingly, even though with all the difficulties, the communications and just having to wait, sometimes sending a message or trying to call someone and you wait for days until they respond. But the good thing for our investigation is that many of the sources were journalists themselves.
Yes.
So they understood the importance of verifying the information. They knew how to do it. And it really speaks to the level and quality of the work that the Palestinian journalists are doing. And there are questions that we see sometimes about are they able to cover this? And they really are. It proved it even more. I knew it, but when I started speaking to them, and for example, they would provide me with a picture, but I need to know when the picture was taken. And even without sometimes asking them to do so, they would send me the timestamp to show exactly when the picture was taken. They provided us with videos. And we have to follow our own organization's rules about verifying information. So we had to get multiple sources to tell us that this happened. We had pictures, we had videos, we had maps, and we did not, I feel, at all give up on following the same standards that we would follow with any other investigation. And the fact that many of the sources were journalists actually helped us with that.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a specific example, because sometimes it's more realistic when you give a specific example. 3 journalists who survived a drone attack in Jabalia spoke to us individually and had basically identical stories. They said what they were doing exactly, on what top hill they were, why they were there, who was around them, the timing, who was injured, who was killed. And when I asked each of them the name of the guy who was killed, and they said, he's from Al-Ajla family. So it was identical. So, I mean, you cannot really miss when you have three sources are giving you, they're not sitting together, they're not impacted by what the others are saying, but they're giving you specific information and a chronology of events and exact timing, exact, situation, who was killed, how many people were injured, how one of them was transferred to hospital by a bulldozer because there was no ambulances. Ambulances could not come to the area. So it was like identical. So this is a specific example when you have journalists giving you their testimonies and they're telling you the story. This is one. I mean, also a big challenge for me, for example, was the death of Samer Abu Dakka, because the only surviving person was Wael Dahdouh, the Al Jazeera bureau chief, and it was very difficult to get to him. But then all the sources that we have spoken to, who came after, who were there when the whole thing started. I mean, when they started moving and so on. So it's like the head of the civil administration and the report, the written report of the civil administration of the events and so on, and the different sources there. And also, just for example, saying that he was shot the first time in this location, and then the second time in this location, and his vest was found in a third location. And I know the area exactly, where they're talking. And so we could, with Google Maps, everything is really easy to locate. And sometimes it's logic and it makes sense. I mean, when you connect the dots, it really makes sense in addition to the sources that we have. So I think that was really, I had doubts, to be honest, when we started this project. I had doubts that we can come to this conclusion. I had doubts about getting to the sources. I had doubts about, evidence, because evidence is so easily being erased in the Gaza Strip and so on. But finally, I think this was a collaboration of everyone, in addition to having people on the ground. I had my sources on the ground, journalists that helped me. One of them is IPI member Basil Khalaf, who left to Egypt. The other one was Ala Salama, who was based in Rafah, and was easy for her to talk to the students of the Farahana school where Samer Abu Dakka was killed, who was also able to speak to the principal of the school and so on. So it was like the local sources that we had also. I mean, yes, it was our names were put on these investigations, but there was a lot of effort made by our colleagues that we all, I think, thank them and appreciate their work.
Mm.
Can I say one more thing about this? I'm sorry.
Please, yeah.
I've had several sources that I spoke with tell me, I double check this because I don't know if I remember it correctly. It's better if you speak to this person. And it happened more times than in the usual reporting. And again, I attribute this to like speaking to a lot of journalists. So I appreciate it very much when they said, I don't know or I don't remember, just speak to someone else.
Mm. Well, of course, in addition to eyewitness testimony, you adopted some really interesting other forms of investigation, other methods. One of them that stands out for me is ballistics analysis. I know you spoke to a lot of ballistics and weapons and audio experts, including an NGO called Earshot. And if anyone doesn't know Earshot, they're quite unusual in that they conduct these so-called sonic investigations. Tell us a little bit about that.
You can take that. So in addition to the eyewitness reports, just going back to your earlier question in terms of how we verify, I think traditionally you would just have human sources, but I think in 2024, with the proliferation of digital technology, we do have a lot of different ways of verifying it. I think the main sort of resources that I use, the way it would work is a lot of the times it would be like a beautiful tennis match between me and Hoda. She'd come and find a piece of information, throw it to me, and I'd, a good example being Press House. We were told that there were tanks parked outside Press House that were firing at it directly. I could go pull up satellite imagery, which was given to us by Planet Labs and Maxar. And the problem with this specific war, again, is that the imagery that we're getting is patchy. They're only on specific dates. So really nailing it is a matter of luck in a lot of cases. But I was able to go and find tank trunks. I was able to find raised embankments where tanks were parked within sort of 50-kilometer radius, and I was able to verify it. And then I was able to throw that back with a specific date, and then they'd come back with the time, and then we could do sort of more chronolocation around it. And then the other part was sort of, I guess, the ballistics analysis and the acoustic analysis are sort of two halves of the same puzzle. So in a lot of cases, especially in sort of like the EFP offices, we're ending up with videos and images that are of reasonably good quality of the aftermath. And a lot of the times we'll come across fragments of munitions, or we'd see, in the case of one journalist, Mohammed Abu Haddad, I was analyzing a video where it's a 3-story building. He lives on the first floor. It was such a surgical strike that it was only his floor that was taken out. The air conditioning unit on the lower floor, which notoriously is fragile, was still standing. The roof above is intact. Like, these are really surgical strikes. So there are only a limited number of weapons that could do it. And more importantly, there's only sort of one side in most cases that has the technology and the advanced weaponry needed to do all of that. So I worked very closely with a lot of my weapons expert sources who worked for the UN as weapons inspectors, or in EOD for the US or British Army. And then the second side of it is acoustics, which is what I worked with Earthshot on, which is, they do sort of like the same stuff that I do with my experts visually, but acoustically. In the case of the Haji building, for example, we had CCTV footage of the exact moment of the strike. So we had the visual moment of the strike where you could pin down the exact date and time, but we also had the acoustics of it. So when you cannot see what hit it, at least you can see how many times it was hit and what probably hit it through the audio of it, by creating what we call a spectrogram, which puts up every single point of impact as a spike on the sound scale. And you can use that to figure out how many times something might have ricocheted inside, or how many times something was fired. And then combined with that and sort of the usual tools of the trade, which is sort of geolocation, chronolocation. Again, this war has an insane amount of footage coming out. So a lot of the time, the job was literally finding a needle in a haystack, and also weeding through the misinformation, because sometimes we'd see an airstrike on a building that would be labeled as, say, Palestine Tower, but it turned out to be Jeffrey Tower. So there's a lot of sort of wading through the mud. But at its heart, yes, we're using sort of cutting edge technology and investigative methodology, but at its heart, we're still doing the same amount of verification that you would do in any normal investigation, just in a different way. We're just being adaptable because of the constraints placed on us.
Mm. While I've got you, Manisha, were there any sort of open source tools or other tricks of the trade that listeners might find interesting to know about that you used in this investigation?
Not off the top of my head, just because the problem is that when I started off doing open source, most of the tools were open source. And now, especially with the advent of commercial satellite imagery, they're very, very expensive, and they're not really open source anymore. So quite a lot of these are proprietary tools. But I think a lot of the time, it's usually the basics of geolocating visually and just trying to figure out where it is, speaking to Walid and Hoda to see if sources on the ground are confirming where something is, and then just following that thread.
Laurent, did you want to come in on that?
No, just to add something to what Manisha just said about how much we needed to have access to satellite pictures. There is one anecdote that I wanted to share because it's quite shocking. We, as I mentioned before, we investigate the targeting of the AFP offices in the tower, and we were able to get access to the satellite picture before the day it happened, and the satellite picture of the day after it happened. And the picture of the day it happened were most available, but not entirely. So we did send a request to Maxar Satellite Picture, which is Maxar Satellite Company, which is one of the biggest satellite picture company in the world that is based in the US. And we did ask them, we did provide them a lot of explanation about why it was so important for 50 journalists from 13 news organizations to access that precise moment of the day of the shooting against the AFP tower. And they never accepted, they never sent us the picture. And that's quite shocking. We even called them publicly through Twitter, please provide us that picture. And so that company decided not to give access to information to 50 journalists on that key question about do the Israeli army is targeting the office of one of the largest press agency in the world. And they refused to get us access to that. So I wanted to, I think by telling that anecdote, which is very sad, not only for journalists, but for public opinion and public information, that tells you a lot about as well what is at stake here and how at some point some companies might take the wrong decision. But we will still looking for that picture, and we won't give up on that.
Thanks for that. I'm aware that it's 4:00, so I've just got one more question before I hand back to Scott. I just want to talk a little bit about the storytelling element of this. It's one thing to gather a lot of material and eyewitness testimony and evidence. It's quite another to then put that into a story that pulls it all together, makes it human, and resonates far and wide. And one of the things that struck me about the Gaza Project was just how much detail and care you all took in humanizing the statistics, these horrible numbers. These were real people who were killed, of course. They had families, hopes, dreams, daily routines. How important for you all was the storytelling aspect, and how did you approach that? I don't know who would like to answer that.
I can just simply say that we told the stories that we heard. I mean, of course, it is an effort to put into, to explain numbers into stories. But at least the stories that I have worked on, we told the story exactly as we heard the story. So it was really, someone telling us, and then we are writing it, So basically, it was how people told us the stories. We have put the stories.
Hoda.
When you asked this question, I remember the one story that we spoke to most people about. Like, we interviewed 25 sources for the story about the 3 journalists who went to cover the expected strike on one building, and then the building they were standing in front was hit. I'm going to put it in the chat after I was done. But it was we had so much testimony. We had long hours of interviews, a lot of pictures and videos. How do we put this all together? And I feel like we tried our best to talk about the 3 journalists. We talked to the 3 wives. We have the last selfie that one of them sent to his wife before he was killed. We were able to get the last video of them. We talked about personal traits that they had, but at the same time also telling the story of how a false evacuation call kind of led to their death because they were standing in front of that building that ended up being hit. And I'll put the link in the chat.
Thanks for that. And thanks to you all. It's really fascinating. We could talk for hours about this, but unfortunately we don't have hours. So I'm going to hand you back to Scott now.
Thanks so much, Tim. And thanks to all of you for this incredibly fascinating and important discussion. I want to maybe just mention to our participants, our listeners today, that if you have any questions for any of our speakers, please do go ahead and post them in the chat or in the Q&A section. We have about 10 minutes left to possibly cover any questions. So please do go ahead and do that. I think while people are thinking about what they might want to know, I think from our side, from my side, I think what would be really interesting to kind of hear from you is maybe 2 things. One is a little bit about the wider impact of this. This is an incredible investigation, extremely important findings on what is I think without a doubt, the biggest journalist safety crisis of our times. Is something going to change? And I know it's difficult to answer that, it's a difficult question. We're journalists, you're journalists. But what can come out of this in terms of possible wider change? Do you see so far, any broader impact from the investigations? And maybe Laura, maybe I would start with you about that. If you have anything to kind of.
Yeah, it's always difficult when, as a journalist, to evaluate the impact we might have, the real impact we might have. And sometimes it might take some years or decades to see some change. And of course, journalists won't be the only ones who will produce the impact. I think honestly that the one of the first, not impact, but signal that we sent, that it was using journalism to defend journalism, basically. And I think it's crucial not only to monitor the threats against journalists, not only to monitor the attack, and not to only to make some index, which is crucial because we have to observe that with precision and to monitor what is happening. But it's very crucial to investigate, and this is what we did: basic journalism. Using different kind of resources to investigate the pattern. That was the story. That was the project. And in addition to that, what we did as well on Forbidden Stories side was to continue the stories of some of them who have been prevented to publish their stories because they were killed or because they were targeted on their way during their assignment. This is how we complete the story of Samira Budaka. This is how we complete the story of the Khalidin brothers who were about to report on the starvation over there and the lack of access to food of some families. And all of that, I think, and I hope, because that was the goal of the project as well, was to rehumanize something that is dehumanized at all, and to transform metrics in stories, to transform numbers in human being perspective and point of view and daily life. And by telling what is happening at 10 a.m. and 22 minutes, and then 10 a.m. and 26 minutes, and then 10:32, you are in the life of the person you are reporting on. And I think for the reader, for the public, for the citizens of the world, when you are reading that kind of project in different kind of languages, coming from journalists who are coming from different kind of countries, where we might all have all bias or perspective on the conflict, I think it's giving one more chance to the public opinion to have a 360 degree vision on what is happening over there, and how much not only the journalists but the civilians are suffering from that. But if the civilians are dying, we need to report on that, and the journalists are now the only ones able by mandate to do that. So the goal was to remind all of that. I hope as well that it might help the Israeli authorities to be convinced a little bit more than it's more than necessary and more than urgent to open their borders to journalists. This is the next step now. We need to go there, and we. As always in the history of humanity, histories of conflict, when journalists are on the field, it will change the things. It will prevent war crimes to be multiplying with no impunity. So that's I think the next step.
Waleed, do you want to come in here as well?
Yeah, I think I mean the impact is on a number of levels. The first level is the impact on Palestinian journalists themselves, because they felt, after these investigations, that someone is watching, someone is actually seeing what's going on. Especially our colleagues in Gaza, they felt that they're not isolated, although they are physically isolated and being displaced, but they felt that sense of solidarity with them. So this is very important, because otherwise, it would have been very hard for them to continue to do their work. The second impact is the fact that we are meeting today. The impact that that this has, had on the global journalism community. The third impact is, that working together, joining forces is something that can do something, that can achieve goals and so on. And I think that the fourth impact is that this is a message that, to all those authorities attacking journalists and committing crimes against journalists, we are watching you. We're there to document what's going on, and we are there to, as journalists and as freedom of expression organizations, we are there to monitor what's going on, and we are there to hold you to account.
Thank you, Walid. I don't know if anyone would else like to come in on this question of impact. Hoda, if you want to add anything, I think I'll leave that out there for you, Hoda, to answer. Maybe still, I just want to put kind of a final question onto the table as well. And I think it's a question that we had one of the participants ask as well, which is a little bit about the next step. Is there a next step? Is there anything that you can share with us about, any work that might continue under the Gaza Project? Do you plan to continue working together? So maybe, if anyone would like to sort of wrap up the question on impact, and maybe let us know if there's anything that you can share about possible next steps.
Let me just quickly talk about impact. I think what we did is, as journalists, inform and document. And I want to point to something, a number. In Arabic, we had 10 stories. This is a combination of investigations worked on by Forbidden Stories that were translated, Arij investigations, the ones we worked on with The Guardian. So those 10 stories were published over 100 times in Arab media organizations. So this in itself is quite, that's in addition to the ones that were published in German and in English and in French. So just like awareness that this is happening. And this is going to be there like it's going to be there as a document that we investigated all of this. I'll leave the question on next steps to Laurent. I think he's best suited to answer that one.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think, definitely on the next step, the Gaza Project is not over. There is no way to say the Gaza Project is over. The war is continuing. Journalists are killed. All the journalists have been killed since the publication of that project. So we'll keep the project on track and keep investigating the killing of and the targeting of journalists over there, and to continue their work. So that's definitely something where we will not give up.
Yeah, one idea might be to focus on female journalists in there. So that's something.
Yeah.
I think that's an important message to end on, both in the sense of that the work will continue, and I think, unfortunately, in some sense, because we see that the killing of journalists in Gaza hasn't stopped, and I think it's also a moment for IPI and for our network to call once again, for the targeting of journalists in Gaza to stop, but the killing of journalists to stop, and for there to be investigations and accountability for what's happening in Gaza. And we really have to thank the journalists that are working to uncover what is happening, not just the journalists involved in the Gaza Project like you all, but also the journalists who are otherwise working on the ground still in Gaza under unimaginable conditions to tell these stories. So I want to thank the four of you for taking part in today's webinar. I think it was hugely important to continue telling these stories, to talk about what you found, how you worked together. So we really appreciate the time that you've taken, and we really appreciate the work that you all put into this incredible project. So thank you very much. And I also want to thank all the participants, all the listeners and viewers that joined us today to watch. And as I said, we'll be putting the video of the webinar online for those who weren't able to make it today live. So thank you very much, everybody. Wish you all a good rest of the day, and thanks again for joining us. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.